Most people believe that power is something you can see. They look for it in the gilded halls of parliaments, the reinforced bunkers of military juntas, or the trending tweets of modern tech billionaires. But those who study the deep architecture of history know that visible power is often a distraction. Real power is quiet. It is mathematical. It is the plumbing of civilization itself. While the world watches the superficial drama of elections and border skirmishes, there is a force that has spent over 2 centuries perfecting the art of being indispensable while remaining invisible. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a study in macro history. It is the story of how the House of Rothschild moved from a cramped ghetto in Frankfurt to the very center of the global financial nervous system. To understand the world of 2026, we must first go back to a time when the map of Europe was being torn apart by the Napoleonic Wars. In the early 19th century, power was biological. It belonged to bloodlines like the Habsburgs or the Bourbons. But Mayer Amschel Rothschild saw a different future. He realized that while kings could be overthrown, the debts they incurred were eternal. He sent his 5 sons, the 5 arrows, to the 5 strategic hearts of Europe: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. Their mission was not to conquer territory, it was to conquer the bond market. The legendary story of the 1815 Battle of Waterloo, where Nathan Rothschild allegedly made a fortune by knowing Napoleon's defeat before anyone else's, often told as a tale of clever betting. But the macro reality is far more profound. The Rothschilds didn't just win a bet, they invented the modern sovereign debt market. They realized that by financing both sides of a conflict, or by providing the liquidity that a bankrupt empire desperately needed, they could transition from being mere moneylenders to becoming the architects of debt. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschilds had achieved something no emperor ever could. They had created a private, international banking network that functioned like a primitive internet. Information traveled through their private couriers faster than through any government diplomatic pouch. This allowed them to act as the de facto central bank of Europe. When the British Empire needed to buy the Suez Canal, they didn't go to a tax collector, they went to the Rothschilds. When the French needed to pay off war indemnities, the signature of a Rothschild was more trusted than the seal of the Republic. This was the birth of the invisible sovereign, a power that sits above the throne, not wearing a crown, but deciding whether a king is creditworthy enough to go to war. If the Rothschilds refused to underwrite a nation's bonds, that nation's military machine would grind to a halt. In this era, they learned the ultimate lesson of power. To control the flow of capital is to control the direction of history. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the nature of power began to change again. The age of the individual great man banker was ending. To survive the coming era of world wars and mass revolutions, the family had to evolve. They had to move from the front of the stage to the shadows of the wings. They had to become the trilateral symphony as the 20th century dawned. The world became a much more dangerous place for visible wealth. The rise of nationalism, the brutality of World War I, and the populist anger of the Great Depression meant that being the world's banker was no longer a safe title to hold. This is the moment in macro history where the House of Rothschild performed its most brilliant maneuver. They intentionally disappeared. While the industrial titans of America, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Fords, were building massive monopolies and plastering their names on skyscrapers, the Rothschilds began a process of radical decentralization. They realized that, in an era of mass media and revolutionary politics, to be seen was to be a target. If you own a bank, people can protest outside its doors. But if you own the network that connects all banks, you become part of the environment itself. This is why, by the mid-1900s, the Rothschild name began to vanish from the lists of the world's richest individuals. While Forbes and Fortune tracked the wealth of new tech moguls and oil barons, the old money was migrating into a complex web of trusts, foundations, and offshore holdings. They shifted from direct ownership to institutional influence. The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 and the Bank for International Settlements (BIS) in 1930 marked a pivotal shift in the plumbing of civilization. These institutions created a layer of insulation between the private interests of high finance and the public scrutiny of government. The Rothschilds, along with a handful of other elite banking families, became the architects of a global governance model that operated through technical expertise rather than political mandates. Think of it as the transition from a king's decree to a central bank's interest rate adjustment. A decree can be fought. An interest rate adjustment is seen as objective economics, by framing financial control as a neutral. Scientific necessity, the invisible sovereign managed to depoliticize power. They were no longer lending to kings, they were stabilizing global markets. During the Cold War, this network played a dual game that few understood. While the world was divided between the Red Star of Moscow and the Blue Stripes of Washington, the Red Shield remained the bridge. They maintained lines of communication and credit that transcended the Iron Curtain, ensuring that no matter who won the geopolitical struggle, the financial infrastructure remained intact. But as the 1990s arrived and the Soviet Union collapsed, a new challenge emerged. Pure financial debt was no longer enough to maintain total control in a digital, globalized world. The invisible sovereign needed a new narrative. They needed a way to align the interests of the entire planet under a single moralized framework. They needed to move from the gold standard to a moral standard. They needed the great pivot. We are now entering the most sophisticated era of the trilateral symphony. In the 19th century, power was about gold. In the 20th century, it was about oil and debt. In the 21st century, the invisible sovereign has realized that the ultimate form of control is the power to define values. This is the great pivot. If you control a nation's currency, you control its economy. But if you control a nation's conscience, you control its future. This is where the Rothschild legacy intersects with the modern global governance movement. By the early 2000s, the family's investment houses began positioning themselves at the vanguard of inclusive capitalism. They weren't just managing wealth, they were architecting the ESG environmental, social, and governance framework. To the untrained eye, ESG looks like a corporate charity initiative. To the macro historian, it is the 21st century version of the credit rating. In the 1800s, if a king didn't follow the Rothschilds' rules, he couldn't get a loan for his war. In 2026, if a corporation or a country doesn't meet the ESG standards, they are effectively debanked from the global system. The 5 arrows have evolved into digital algorithms that determine which industries live, and which die all under the banner of saving the planet. But here is where the story takes a dark geopolitical turn. The world is no longer a unipolar playground. The rise of the BRICS, nations led by China and Russia, represents a direct challenge to the Western-centric financial plumbing that the Rothschilds helped build. This is the clash of titans. On one side, we have the institutional West, governed by private central banks, international NGOs, and old money families. On the other side, we have nationalist sovereignty, where states like China use their own state-run banks to bypass the traditional London-New York axis. The question for the next decade is simple. Can the invisible sovereign survive a world that is breaking into fragments? The answer lies in their history. They have survived the fall of Napoleon, the rise of Hitler, the collapse of empires, and the birth of the internet. They don't fight the tide, they own the water. Even as the dollar faces challenges, the network is already pivoting towards central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and green bonds. They are building the new plumbing before the old one even bursts. As we conclude this journey through macro history, we must ask ourselves, why does the Rothschild name still spark so much controversy? Why are there so many conspiracy theories? The truth is more unsettling than any fiction. Conspiracy theories actually protect the elite. By making the invisible sovereign sound like a cartoon villain from a movie, the public fails to see the real, mathematical, and legal ways that power is exercised every day. Real power isn't a secret meeting in a dark room. It's the fine print in a sovereign bond agreement. It's the interest rate set by a committee of unelected technocrats. It's the carbon credit system that transforms the air we breathe into a tradable financial asset. Wealth is temporary, governments are fleeting, but infrastructure is eternal. The House of Rothschild didn't just accumulate money, they built the operating system of the modern world. If you held the keys to the world's debt, would you ever want the world to know your name? Probably not. You would want them to keep arguing about politicians and celebrities while you continue to conduct the trilateral symphony from the shadows.